why the condemnation on polygyny, but not on race mixing.
Well, you find many of the patriarchs having more than one wife, but I think that it's clear from the scriptures that having multiple wives was never seen as a good thing. It was always seen as being less than the ideal, but it wasn't prohibited in the Old Testament. Although by the end of the Old Testament period, it was very rare among Jews, actually. But it was certainly practiced in the patriarchal period. And when you're talking about the kings of Israel and Judah, we know that they had more than a few wives. Solomon had 400 wives and 600 concubines, so he had 1,000 wives in total. And obviously, that was not a good thing for him. It wound up causing him to have a spiritual fall, for which he repented according to tradition and according to the book of Ecclesiastes. But nevertheless, it obviously was not a good thing in his case. And even in the prophet King David's case, he had a number of wives that we read about in the accounts of his life. But because he had a number of wives, a lot of his family problems derive from that. Because for example, he had one son who wound up raping his half sister. Well, it probably wouldn't have happened if he'd only had one wife and only had children from that one wife, but that's not how it actually went down. So, but the thing is, if you were going to argue, well, it was allowed in the Old Testament, but it's not allowed in the New Testament, well, you'd have to have something in the New Testament that said don't marry people of a different ethnicity, but there's nothing like that in the New Testament. St. Paul says, when he's talking about remarriage, like if someone's wife or husband dies, that they can remarry, but only in the Lord. In other words, they can only marry someone who's a Christian. Doesn't say anything about their ethnicity, though. And we know that from the New Testament itself, and also from church history, there were a great many people who were Jewish and married someone who was of Gentile background or something like that. And it was never seen as a problem as long as they were both Christians. So and there, in all the canons of the church, there's not one canon that says don't allow people to marry someone of a different ethnicity. You're not allowed to marry a non-believer, but you are never prohibited from marrying someone who's a different skin color or a different ethnicity.